Well, 2024 is coming to a close, and you know what that means. It is time for my end of year list where I count down my favorite 20 albums that came out of Montreal in the year 2024. But before we begin, if this is the first time you've ever seen my face, then hello, welcome. My name is Chris the Frog, and I host a channel called Sewer Spewer, which started off as a radio show, but I have since moved on to video content, mostly on Instagram and on TikTok. And this is my first time attempting to do a video on YouTube, and I will be uploading a version of this to TikTok in 2 parts. And the goal of the channel is to promote music in Montreal. And every week I'm putting out a video listing all of the shows happening in Montreal within the punk, metal, and alt-rock genres. And I'm also putting out listings as well as playlists. And if that sounds like something you might be interested in, then go follow me on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, and on Facebook. And be sure to subscribe to me here on YouTube. Now, my end of year list has been a tradition since 2015, though the list started off as a top 5 and then a top 10, and now it has grown to a top 20. And before we jump right into it, I have to go over some ground rules. First of all, I will not be ranking these albums because I like each one for different reasons and it doesn't seem fair to put one over the other. So rather, I will be listing them in alphabetical order. Number 2, these are my personal favorite albums. I'm not saying that they are the best of all time. So if you have any complaints about some of the choices on my list, I encourage you to make your own damn list. And finally, a lot of the bands that I put on this list are personal friends of mine. That's just because I have a lot of friends within this music scene. And also, it's not my fault my friends just happen to be incredibly talented. So with that out of the way, let's get straight to the first band. So first, we have Pest and their third album, You and Me at the End of the Fucking World, which came out on August 30th.
I found time in a hollow without place.
It's hard to nail down which genre Pest fall into. I think the genre that best describes them is progressive deathcore, but there's so much more to that sound. And their music sounds both modern and very nostalgic as well in an early 2000s MySpace core kind of way. The project began as a solo project for the singer/guitarist April, but has now grown into a 3-piece, and that really comes across in this album. There's more of a collaborative feel to it, and there's also a lot of guest vocals on it, including that one that I just played for you, which features vocals from Nat of the Ottawa band Neurotypes. Next, we have Autre and their debut album, Le Pire Est à Venir, which came out on June 14th. Autre are a post-rock shoegaze band with members originally from the Abitibi-Gaspésie area, but have since moved to Montreal. And the first time I actually listened to this album, it didn't quite grab me the way I wanted it to, just because I'm quite picky when it comes to shoegaze. But I'm glad I gave it another chance, because listening to it a second time, I noticed more sound textures and effects that they were using to manipulate their music, and I just really got more and more into the overall vibe of the album. Next, we have Barnacle, and their second album, Such a Waste, which came out on 4/20. Barnacle are a surf punk band, so they have that kind of chugging style and effects that make it sound like they're underwater. Their first album is more of a collection of old songs that were previously released on EPs and demos. But with this album, none of the songs were released beforehand, so it sounds a lot more fresh and new. And on this album, Barnacle move away from the gimmick of beaches and surfing. And they still have aquatic-themed songs on this album, but they also have other songs that deal with mental health. so it really shows that they are not just a one-trick pony. Next on the list we have Capable and their debut album Le Désordre Organisé, which came out on February 23rd. Capable are a francophone pop-punk band, though they describe their music as emo crust. And even though the band has been around for almost a decade, up until now they only put out EPs, but I did love the songs on those EPs, so when this album came out I knew I had to include it. And there's a lot of sing-along moments on this album, and it has a great sense of humor, which I love in a band, but I also find a lot of the songs very sentimental, especially as someone who grew up in the Montreal scene. A lot of these songs kind of surround this feeling of community. Next up on the list is Cell Press and their debut album Cages, which came out on March 8th. Cell Press are a noise rock band, and is it fair to call them a supergroup just because the members have been involved in so many other projects? And this is the only album this year that I purchased on vinyl, just because my finances this year were a bit tight, but this purchase was really worth it. I'm a big fan of the guitarist's other band, The Great Sabatini, so I love the big riffs on this album, and I also love the very impressive drum work from Mark, as well as the primal screams from the singer PQ. Next is Chou, with their second album, Blanc, which came out on October 18th. Chou are a comedic anarcho-punk band, and this album is a lot heavier compared to their previous self-titled album, and that in part is due to the guest vocals on this album from François of the band Fuck Tout, and Simon from Gun Tway. Also, I love that the album cover is just the Beatles' White Album, except with a piece of duct tape on it. Genius. Next up is CiDB, and their debut album, Warning, may contain bedbugs, which was released on November 29th. CiDB are a moshcore band, and their name stands for Catapulting Infected Dead Bodies. And there's a lot of humor on this album. They have a song about Montreal traffic, a tribute song to Steve Irwin, and a 6-second song about bedbugs, but they also get serious when they have to. And it's a great mix of these hardcore moments as well as straight up punk rock, and it's a lot of fun. Next is Dopethrone, with their 6th album, Broke Sabbath, released on May 24th. I've been a big fan of this sludge metal band since listening to their 2015 album, Hochelaga, but with this album they go a lot more grimy and filthy with their sound, and it's surprising that they have this big international following because they haven't changed their sound at all over the years, and they've stayed more or less independent over their long career, and you won't be able to find this album on Spotify, so you'll have to go to Bandcamp to listen to it. Next up is Endform, and their second album, Menace, which came out on August 14th. I'm a huge sucker for that neo-crust punk sound, and Endform encapsulate that so perfectly. I find this album very emotionally effective because it has these long instrumental build-ups as well as this very beautiful poetic spoken word from Marie-Ève, and then it builds and builds and builds to these crashing drums and very guttural growls, and it's just amazing. Next we have Family Man, and their debut album, Iconoclast, released on March 22nd. often recommend Family Man to friends who are fans of idols because they have that post-punk sound to them. But there's also moments that are a bit more mellow, more alternative, or indie. But it's really the hard-rocking, catchy moments that grab me on this album. Continuing on with the list, we have General Chaos and their debut album, Out of My Way, which came out on September 27th. General Chaos are a punk band made up of teenagers around the 15, 16, 17 year mark. But don't be so quick to dismiss them because we oftentimes forget that some of the most classic punk albums were written by 15 and 16-year-olds. And the music on this album is very impressive for this age. And I also just love the kind of snotty classic punk sound this has, similar to, say, Rancid or early Green Day. So yeah, keep an eye out for these kids because they are going places. Next up is Insade and their debut album, Human Obsession, released on January 4th. Insade are a death metal band with an old school sound, and this was the first album that I listened to this year, and I immediately knew that it would appear on my end of year list. And it's a huge jump in quality in terms of production compared to their previous album. Their last album was a bit too raw for my liking, but the production on this one is excellent. Moving on, we have Jodie Roger and their second album, Wonder of You, Turnstile, released on April 17th. Jodie Roger is a rapper who blends screamo, pop punk, some black metal, as well as noise rap. And they perform under two personalities, I believe. One is called Solomon Grundy, and the other one is called Rudy St. Clair, though this album really belongs to Solomon Grundy, who is the more dark and aggressive personality. And when I first listened to this album, I just put it on as background noise when I was doing chores, but I was just so struck by the variety on this album that I had to stop what I was doing and just focus on the music because I was just so taken aback by it. Alrighty then, next we have The Lookout and their debut album, I Know the Future, released on October 18th. I was a big fan of The Lookout's punk rock sound, and I love the music that they put out previously on EPs. So when this album was announced, even before listening to it, I knew that it would end up on my end of year list. And I absolutely love the singer Martha's voice on this record. She just has this great, powerful, classic rock and roll voice that makes The Lookout really unique. Next up is Pnoom and their debut album, Energy, released on November 22nd. Pnoom are a psychedelic, experimental post-punk band, and only this year I found out that they got their name from the legendary krautrock band Can off of their failed album Prepare to Meet Thy Pnoom. So there's a little factoid for you. The music on this is very spacey at times, but it has a lot of driving energy, hence the album title, and it's just a great album to zone out to. Next up is PyPy, with their second album, Sacred Times, released on October 18th. PyPy are a psych garage punk supergroup with members of Duchess Says and Red Mass, and it's been 10 years since the release of their previous album, Pagan Day, but it's really worth the wait. I absolutely love the bass tone on this album, and the vocals sound really cool. All of the instruments sound really cool. We're almost at the end now, so next we have Sons of Arrakis with their second album, Volume 2, released on June 7th. Sons of Arrakis are a Dune-themed desert rock band, and they timed the release of this album around the same time as the sequel for Denis Villeneuve's Dune, when Dune Fever was at an all-time high. And on this album, they expand on the sound that they first introduced on their first album, and they switch up with the instrumentation, but they still have those great desert rock riffs on this album that are just mwah. Next is Spectral Wound, and their fourth album, Songs of Blood and Mire, which was released on August 23rd. Spectral Wound are the kings of black metal in Montreal, and the sound and production on this album are just so great, which is really unheard of in the black metal genre. And I'm not the only one who loves this album. A lot of people around the world are just devouring it, and it has made several end-of-year lists, including Decibel's Top 40. I think they're ranked at like number 3, which is incredible for a Montreal band. And even though this album was released in the summer, there's just something so frigid and cold about its sound. It just makes me feel like I'm stuck in the middle of the woods in the dead of winter. Next up, we have Truck Violence with their debut album, Violence, released on July 5th. Truck Violence are an enigma to me because they started off as a rap group simply called Truck, but then they evolved to hardcore, but they also integrate shoegaze and folk with use of a banjo. And the vocals on this album are very interesting because they have this kind of mournful, drunken, poetic delivery. Overall, it's just a very interesting album, and I'm absolutely fascinated by it. And finally, we're at the end of our list with Will to Speak and their debut album, Coward's Game, which was released on October 11th. Will to Speak really nailed down that traditional hardcore sound, and for a while I was debating if I should even include this on my list just because the album is really short. All the tracks clock in at around 1 minute, and I know EPs who are even longer than this album, but ultimately I think that's what hardcore should be. Really fast, to the point, hard-hitting songs that don't overstay their welcome. So that's it. Those are my favorite 20 albums that came out of Montreal in the year 2024. I listened to a total of 50 albums this year, so it was really hard deciding which ones will go on the list, so I'm still gonna give some honorable mentions here. First off to Hood Rats and their album Crime, Hysteria, and Useless Information, Claiborne with their self-titled album, Mutank and their album Think Before You Think, which I believe was recorded pre-pandemic and just took a while to put out, French Frogs with their album Solution Tranchante, and Dissimulator with their album Lower Form Resistance. So if you got this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. I'm hoping to make more videos like this in the future. And if you want to hear music from these bands that I mentioned, then go to the link in the description, and that will lead you to the last episode of my radio show where I play a song each from these 20 bands. And if you want to see more content like this, just let me know in the comments, and be sure to follow me on social media at SewerSpewer on TikTok, Facebook, and on Instagram, and on YouTube. I'm running out of things to say, so I'll end it here. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, ribbit ribbit!